Lavinia Mercer is 68 years old, standing in a law office in downtown Harwick with her hands folded in her lap, and the look on her face gives nothing away. Her husband Owen is 4 weeks dead. The will is being read. Fletcher Payne, Owen's son from his first marriage, is already smiling before the lawyer finishes page 2. By the time the reading reaches the last item, a condemned cottage on the edge of county land, assessed value $6, Fletcher is laughing out loud. He turns to Lavinia and says, "Well, at least you got something." What Fletcher didn't know was that beneath the rotting floor of that $6 cottage, something had been sealed into the earth since 1931. When Lavinia found it, everything he thought he'd taken came back with interest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lavinia and Owen Mercer had been married for 31 years. She was 37 when they met, working as a bookkeeper for a small agricultural supply company in Nashville. He was 42, a quiet, deliberate man who ran a modest but well-respected land surveying firm out of Harwick. He had one son from a previous marriage, Fletcher, then 14, who came to every Sunday dinner with the particular silence of a boy who had already decided he didn't like the new arrangement. Owen never forced it. He let the relationship between Lavinia and Fletcher develop at whatever pace it would, which turned out to be no real pace at all. Fletcher tolerated Lavinia the way a tenant tolerates a landlord, civilly, minimally, with one eye always on the exit. When Fletcher left for college, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Owen relaxed. Lavinia exhaled. The two of them built something good in the years that followed, steady, unflashy, rooted in the kind of daily work that doesn't make for interesting stories but makes for a solid life. Owen's surveying firm grew slowly and then steadily. He was careful with money, careful with contracts, careful with everything except his own health, which he neglected the way busy men often do until there was nothing left to do about it. He died of a cardiac event on a Wednesday morning in February, age 71, in the kitchen of the house they'd shared for 2 decades. Lavinia was in the next room. She heard him fall. Fletcher drove up from Memphis the next morning. He brought his wife Serena, who wore a black dress and an expression of practiced sympathy that didn't quite reach her eyes. Within 48 hours of Owen's death, Fletcher had placed a call to Mr. Albright's office requesting an expedited reading of the will. Lavinia noticed. She said nothing. The reading was scheduled for a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the funeral. Lavinia arrived early, dressed neatly in her gray wool coat, and took the chair closest to the door. Fletcher and Serena arrived together and settled into the 2 chairs directly across from Mr. Albright's desk, positioning themselves like people who were there to receive something owed. Mr. Albright opened the file. His voice was flat and professional, careful in the way lawyers are when they already know the room is about to split in 2. Owen's surveying firm went to Fletcher, along with full authority to liquidate or continue at his discretion. The house in Harwick, the one Lavinia had lived in for 22 years, where she had painted every room and planted every shrub in the front garden, went to Fletcher as well. The savings account, the truck, the investment portfolio Owen had built across 30 years of careful work. All of it to Fletcher. Serena reached over and touched Fletcher's arm. He covered her hand with his. Mr. Albright cleared his throat and looked at Lavinia. There was one remaining item. He slid a single sheet across the desk. A property deed, county recorded, dated 1987. A cottage on Pratt Hollow Road, listed in county records as uninhabitable, sitting on a half-acre of scrubland just outside the Harwick town line. Assessed value at the time of Owen's death, $6. The figure had been assigned by a county assessor who hadn't visited the property in person. $6 was simply the floor, the minimum taxable value the county applied to land with a structure too far gone to be worth calculating. Fletcher laughed. Not a polite, restrained sound, a full laugh, the kind that fills a small room and bounces off the walls. He leaned back in his chair and looked at Lavinia with the open satisfaction of a man who had been waiting a long time for a moment like this. "Well," he said, At least you got something. Serena smiled at the desk. Lavinia looked at the deed. Pratt Hollow Road. Single-story wood-framed cottage built circa 1910, currently condemned. She read the address twice, folded the paper once, and put it in her coat pocket. She thanked Mr. Albright. She stood up, buttoned her coat, and walked out of the office without looking at Fletcher or Serena again. Outside, the February air cut right through her. She stood on the sidewalk in downtown Harwick for a long moment with the deed in her pocket and 31 years of marriage reduced to $6 on a county assessor's ledger. But Owen had left her that cottage on purpose. She was certain of it. He was not a careless man. He had never done anything without a reason, and he had spent 31 years of marriage making sure she knew that when he said something mattered, it mattered. He had left her that cottage for a reason. She walked to her car, started the engine, and drove. Lavinia left Nashville at 6 in the morning, 3 days after the will reading. One bag in the trunk, the deed in her coat pocket, and a handwritten address on a notepad sitting on the passenger seat because she didn't fully trust the phone signal to hold once she cleared the city. The drive south took an hour and 40 minutes. Nashville gave way to suburbs, then the suburbs thinned into fields, and the fields eventually gave way to the kind of country that doesn't advertise itself. Low ridges covered in cedar and hardwood, creek beds visible through the tree lines. Farmhouses set well back from roads that hadn't been widened since the 1970s. She passed a barn with a collapsed roof that had clearly been collapsing for at least a decade. Nobody had torn it down. Nobody had fixed it. It just leaned there at the edge of someone's property, half in and half out of the tree line, and the road curved past it and kept going. Harwick appeared without announcement. A water tower, a gas station with one pump, a post office the size of a living room. The main street ran 4 blocks and held a hardware store, a diner with a hand-painted sign in the window, a feed supply, and a church that looked older than everything around it. The traffic light at the center of town blinked yellow in both directions. Lavinia drove through it twice before she found the county road she needed. Rural Route 7 began where the pavement ended. The gravel lane ran east into the tree line, following the bend of a creek she could hear through the underbrush but couldn't see. She drove slowly, the car rocking over ruts frozen hard from the February cold. After about 1.5 miles, the lane curved around a stand of old sycamores, their bark white and peeling, and the cottage came into view. She stopped the car and sat looking at it through the windshield for a long moment. It was small. Single-story wood frame, the white paint faded to the color of old bone. The porch roof sagged on the left side where a support post had rotted at its base, and by the angle of the lean, it had been sagging for years. 2 windows flanked the front door, both intact but filmed over with age. Beside the cottage stood the remains of an outbuilding, a shed or small workshop, its roof half gone, walls still holding. Vines had worked their way up the chimney on the south side and spread across the roofline in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, the way things look when nature has had enough time to arrange itself. The 4 acres behind the structure ran back into bare winter woods. It was not much to look at, but it was standing, and that counted for something. She got out of the car, pulled her coat tight against the cold, and walked to the front door. The key Owen had left, tucked into a small paper envelope clipped to the deed, was plain iron, old but clean. The lock resisted at first. She held the key firm and the mechanism turned. The door opened inward. Cold air and cedar, and something underneath both of those, something dry and papery she couldn't name yet. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The front room was a single open space, maybe 20 feet across. Stone fireplace on the north wall, its hearth swept clean. 2 wooden chairs pushed against the far wall, their seats rotted through, as if someone had tidied up before leaving and never came back. The floorboards were wide pine, darkened with age and scattered with grit, but solid. She walked 3 different lines across the room, heel to toe, listening and feeling. No give, no soft spots. Good. Dust lay over everything in a thin, even coat, the kind that settles across decades, not years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A narrow hallway at the back of the front room led to a bedroom and a rear door. She walked it slowly, one hand trailing the wall, noting where the plaster had cracked and where it had held. The bedroom was bare except for a rusted iron bed frame and a small wooden chest pushed against the wall beneath the window. She crouched and lifted the lid. Inside, a folded wool blanket, stiff with cold and age, and beneath it, sealed in a clear plastic bag that looked far newer than anything else in the room, a letter. She recognized the handwriting before she had fully pulled it free from the bag. Owen's script. The same careful, slightly forward-leaning letters he had used in every note he had ever left on the kitchen counter, every birthday card, every margin annotation in the books he read and passed to her. Lavinia sat down on the floor of that cold bedroom with her back against the wall and the letter in both hands. The cottage held its silence around her. Outside, the creek ran on unseen through the underbrush, and the bare sycamores stood over the lane, and the whole hollow waited. She opened the letter and began to read. Owen's note was 2 pages, written on the same cream-colored paper he used for everything that mattered to him. She read it once fast, then again slowly, the way you reread something when the first pass doesn't fully land. My Lavinia, if you're reading this in that bedroom, you found the key and you drove out here alone, and you're probably already trying to figure out what I was thinking. That's you. That's always been you. You never waited for someone else to explain a room to you. You just walked through it and figured it out yourself. I need you to trust me for a little longer. The cottage belonged to my grandfather before it came to me. He bought it in 1927 from a man named Cornelius Pratt, who built it and lived in it alone from 1908 until he sold it and left Harwick without telling anyone where he was going. My grandfather kept the property out of habit more than intention, and my father kept it the same way, and I inherited it the same way. Like a piece of furniture you don't know where to put, so you put it nowhere and keep stepping around it. I almost sold it twice. Both times something stopped me. I couldn't explain it then. I can now, but explaining it in a letter is the wrong way. The right way is for you to find it yourself, because when you find it the way I found it, you'll understand it the same way I did. Go to the outbuilding, the north wall. You'll know what you're looking at when you see it. The thing I need you to find has waited a very long time already. A few more hours won't change anything. I love you. I trusted you with this because you're the only person I know who will understand what it means to keep something safe for people who can no longer keep it themselves. Come find me in what I left you. Owen. She folded the letter along its original creases and placed it back in the plastic bag. She sat with it in her hands for another minute, looking at the window above the iron bed frame where the flat winter light came through the clouded glass and fell across the floor in a pale, thin rectangle. Then she stood, tucked the letter into her coat pocket beside the deed, and went outside. The outbuilding sat about 30 feet from the cottage's back corner. Up close, it was in worse shape than it had looked from the car. The east side roof had given way entirely, leaving a gap where daylight dropped straight in, and the ground beneath had gone soft from years of rain coming through unchecked. She stepped carefully, staying near the walls where the earth was firmer. The south wall and the west wall were plain board construction, vertical planks weathered to gray, ordinary in every way. The north wall was different. It took a moment to understand why. The boards there ran horizontal, not vertical like the others, and they were thicker. She could tell by feel when she pressed her palm flat against them. Less weathered on the surface, too, as if something had kept the worst of the moisture off them. And the fit was too good. No warping, no gaps, no cracks where you could see daylight through. Whoever set those boards had done it with a care that had nothing to do with building a shed. She pressed along the wall in sections, moving left to right. About 2/3 across, a section roughly 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall shifted under her hand. Not dramatically. A 1/4 inch, maybe a little more, but it moved. She pressed again, harder. The section moved again, pivoting slightly inward from its right edge. She worked her fingers into the gap that opened on that side and pulled. The panel swung outward on hinges she hadn't noticed because they were set flush with the wood and painted over in the same faded gray as everything around them. Behind the panel was a door a real door set directly into the stone foundation of the outbuilding, with iron strapping across its face and a padlock through a hasp on the right side. Lavinia looked at it for a long moment. A hidden door in the foundation of a falling-down shed on 4 acres of Tennessee woodland that Fletcher had dismissed without a second thought. She thought about the way Serena's face had arranged itself into something resembling sympathy at the will reading. She thought about Fletcher's joke about the lumber and how he hadn't looked at her when he made it because contempt that comfortable doesn't need eye contact. She took the iron key from her coat pocket. She had assumed it unlocked the cottage. She hadn't tried it anywhere else. It fit the padlock perfectly. It took both hands and more force than she expected, but the shackle released with a hard snap. She pulled the padlock free, gripped the iron handle, and swung the door open. Cold air moved up past her immediately, rising from below like a held breath finally released. The smell reached her a second later. The same dry, papery quality she'd noticed in the cottage, but richer here and layered under it something else, something herbal and faintly sharp, she associated with old pharmacies, with her grandmother's medicine cabinet, with rooms that had held dried plants and glass bottles for longer than anyone now living could remember. A wooden staircase ran down from the doorframe into darkness. She stood at the top and listened. From somewhere below came a faint, steady hum. Quiet and low and entirely mechanical, the sound of something that had been running for a very long time without anyone asking it to stop. Lavinia went back to her car for her phone. She stood one more moment in the cold of the hollow, listening to the creek she still couldn't see and the bare branches moving overhead. Then she turned on the flashlight, stepped through the door, and went down. The stairs went down further than made sense for a building that small. She counted 14 steps before the flashlight beam reached the bottom and spread across a floor of flat stone. The walls on either side of the staircase were cut stone too, dry-laid without mortar, fitted together with the kind of patience that belongs to a different era entirely. No water damage, no cave smell. The air was cool and dry and carried that herbal sharpness she had caught at the top of the stairs, stronger now, complex in a way she couldn't fully sort. Dried roots and something resinous, and underneath it all the particular smell of very old paper, kept in very good conditions. She stepped off the last stair and stood still, sweeping the flashlight slowly across the room. It was one long chamber, maybe 50 feet from end to end and 20 feet wide, with a ceiling that cleared her head by about 2 feet. Running the full length of both side walls were wooden shelves, floor to ceiling, built from the same heavy lumber as the hidden panel above. Every shelf held something. Glass jars by the dozen, sealed with wax, their contents dried to browns and grays. Labeled bottles, the paper tags faded but legible up close. Wooden boxes stacked in ordered rows, each marked in a small, precise hand. And between the shelves, at intervals along both walls, flat wooden drawers labeled with dates and categories she couldn't make out from where she stood. At the far end of the chamber, a workbench ran the full width of the wall. Above it, mounted into the stone, were 2 small electric lights, the source of the hum she had heard from above. Both were still on. Both were still working, powered by something she couldn't see. Lavinia walked the length of the room slowly, flashlight in one hand, the other trailing along the edge of the shelving. She stopped at the first set of labeled jars and leaned close to read. Valerian root, harvested September 1914. Black cohosh, dried 1919. Golden seal, cultivated stand, East Slope. The labels were written in a hand she didn't recognize, careful, upright letters, the ink brown with age but clear. She pulled open one of the flat drawers. Inside, laid flat in 2 rows, were journals. She lifted the top one carefully. The cover was plain brown board, worn at the corners. Inside the front cover, written in the same hand as the jar labels, C.W. Pratt. Remedies and Observations. Vulner 4, 1916. Cornelius Pratt. She set it down and opened the next drawer. More journals, earlier dates. The drawer below that held maps. hand-drawn survey maps on heavy paper showing the 4 acres around the cottage and extending outward in all directions, annotated with plant names, water sources, soil notations, and in the margins, compass bearings and measurements she couldn't immediately interpret. She counted 11 maps before she stopped counting. The third section of shelving along the right wall held a different category of material. These drawers were wider, the labels written in a newer hand. Owen's hand, she realized. She pulled the first one open. Inside, in a clear protective sleeve, was a document. She lifted it toward the overhead light and read the header. Office of the County Clerk, Harwick, Tipton County, Tennessee. Deed of Trust and Covenant, dated March 3, 1931. She carried it to the workbench and laid it flat under the light. It took her 20 minutes to read it fully and another 20 to read it again, because the first time through she kept stopping at sentences that didn't seem possible. Cornelius Pratt had not simply been an herbalist living alone in the Tennessee woods. He had spent 23 years mapping, cataloging, and formally documenting the land around his property in a level of detail that no county surveyor had ever matched. In 1929, 2 years before he filed the trust document, a geological survey commissioned by a railroad company had confirmed what his own maps had already recorded, that the land beneath and surrounding his 4 acres sat above one of the largest untapped mineral deposits in that region of Tennessee. Limestone, feldspar, and a band of high-grade clay that ran for nearly 3 miles in a northwest line directly beneath the hollow. The railroad survey had been buried. The company had moved its route. Nobody official had ever followed up on the findings. But Cornelius Pratt had known. He had known for years, and in 1931, 4 years after selling the surface rights to Owen's grandfather and leaving Harwick, he had filed a trust through a Nashville attorney that placed the subsurface mineral rights, the rights to everything below 6 feet of topsoil, on the original 4 acres, and the adjacent undeveloped parcels, into a covenant tied to the property deed. The trust was structured to transfer automatically to the owner of record on the 100th anniversary of its filing. March 3, 1931. March 3, 2031 was 6 years away, but Owen's drawer held more documents beneath the trust. A letter from a property attorney, dated 8 months before Owen's death. A mineral rights valuation report, current comparable transactions in the county, a projected figure for the subsurface rights based on modern extraction values and the current market for construction-grade limestone and feldspar. The projected figure had 7 digits. Lavinia set the last document down on the workbench and stood in that underground room with the hum of the old lights above her and the smell of 100 years of careful keeping all around her. And she understood everything. Owen had known what was here. He had spent the last year of his life making sure she would find it and making sure she would find it alone. He had left the company to Fletcher because the company, stripped of the embezzlement Lavinia didn't yet know about, was the smaller thing. He had left her the cottage because the cottage was the door to this. She looked at the shelves, the journals, the maps, the sealed jars of dried plants that Cornelius Pratt had labeled by hand in 1914 and 1916 and 1919. She pulled out a chair from beneath the workbench, sat down, and started reading from the beginning. She spent 4 days in the archive before she drove back to Nashville. She didn't tell anyone where she had been. She checked out of the hotel, moved into a furnished room above a hardware store on the east side of the city, and spent the first week back making 2 lists. The first was everything she knew. The second was everything she still needed to find out. The second list was longer, but the first one had enough on it to keep her moving. The attorney she hired was named Josephine Tate. A friend of a friend had used her in a property dispute 3 years earlier and described her as the kind of lawyer who read every page of every document before she opened her mouth and never said anything twice. Lavinia called her on a Tuesday and met her on Thursday. She brought photocopies of the trust document, the mineral rights valuation report, Owen's letter, and the attorney correspondence she had found in Owen's drawer in the archive. Josephine Tate read everything without speaking. She asked 4 questions when she finished. Then she sat back and said, "This is real." All of it. She said it the way someone says a thing they want on record before the conversation continues. They spent 2 hours going through the legal structure of the 1931 trust. The transfer mechanism was unusual, but not unprecedented. Josephine had seen similar instruments from the same era, filed by landowners who had reason to hide the value of their subsurface holdings from creditors or from state assessors. Cornelius Pratt had used a Nashville attorney named Aldous Fenwick, who had been meticulous. The document had been registered, witnessed, filed in 2 counties, and cross-referenced to the original deed. It had simply been waiting, correctly and legally, for 93 years for anyone with the patience to look. The question, Josephine said, is whether Fletcher knows this exists. That question sent Lavinia to her second hire. Oscar Reeves ran a one-man financial investigation firm out of a rented office in Brentwood. He was 63, former IRS, and had the manner of a man who found other people's financial records genuinely interesting in the way other people find crossword puzzles interesting. He took the case without asking for a retainer. He said he'd send an invoice when he had something worth billing for. He had something worth billing for inside of 3 weeks. Owen's company had been losing money in a specific and deliberate pattern for 7 years. Not losing it through bad contracts or mismanagement, losing it through a system of internal transfers that move funds from operating accounts into a set of subsidiary accounts that Greer, Fletcher's attorney, had helped establish in Fletcher's name. The transfers were small individually, calibrated to stay under audit thresholds. Collectively, they added up to just over $1.4 million over 7 years. Owen had almost certainly never seen them. His access to the day-to-day accounts had narrowed as his health declined, and Fletcher took on more operational control. By the time Owen restructured his estate, the company he thought he was leaving his son was already significantly hollowed out. Oscar laid the documents on Lavinia's kitchen table and walked her through each transfer line by line. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked him if it was enough to prosecute. He said that wasn't his determination to make, but he knew 3 assistant district attorneys in Davidson County who would find the documentation interesting. She told him to hold it for now. Meanwhile, Fletcher had started moving on the Harwick property. The first signal was a certified letter from the Tipton County Assessor's Office, informing her that the 4 acres on rural Route 7 had been subject to a reassessment, and the taxable value had increased by a factor of 9. The letter included a payment schedule. The increase was not catastrophic on its own, but paired with her current income, which was minimal since the Nashville house was gone and Owen's accounts were gone and what she had left was savings. It was a pressure play. Someone had prompted the reassessment. Lavinia gave the letter to Josephine. The second signal came 6 weeks later. A development company called Tipton Rural Holdings filed a petition with the county planning office to have the rural Route 7 parcel condemned under a rarely used provision allowing forced acquisition of deteriorated structures, deemed public safety hazards. The petition cited the outbuilding's collapsed roof and the cottage's sagging porch as evidence of hazard. Tipton Rural Holdings had been incorporated 11 months earlier. Its registered agent was a man named Greer, Fletcher's attorney. Lavinia read the condemnation petition at the kitchen table in her rented room, had a glass of water, and called Josephine. She was not surprised. She had expected something like this from the moment she found the trust documents. Fletcher didn't know exactly what was under the property, but he knew Owen had cared enough about those 4 acres to put them in the will, and that alone was enough reason to want them. Fletcher operated on instinct sharpened by greed. He didn't need to know the specifics to know the land was worth pursuing. What he didn't know was that she had spent the past 3 months quietly preparing for exactly this moment. The cottage had been partially restored by a crew out of Harwick who asked no questions and did good work. The archive below was documented, photographed, and copied, every journal, every map, every deed, every document, with copies held by Josephine's office, Oscar's office, and a safety deposit box in Nashville. The mineral rights valuation had been updated with a current appraisal firm, signed and sealed. And Oscar's files on Fletcher's embezzlement sat in a locked drawer in Josephine's office, ready. Lavinia let Tipton Rural Holdings file its petition. She let the county assessor's increased bill sit on her counter. She let Fletcher make his moves without responding because she had learned something in 68 years of watching people like him operate. They only stopped when they had nothing left to reach for, so she let him reach. Fletcher came on a Saturday in May, 3 months after the condemnation petition landed on Lavinia's counter. She knew he was coming before he arrived. Josephine had a contact in the Tipton County Planning Office who mentioned that someone matching Fletcher's description had stopped in the week prior asking questions about the rural Route 7 parcel, the status of the petition, and the timeline for a forced acquisition ruling. The contact said the man had been impatient and not particularly polite about it. That sounded right. Lavinia was in the cottage when she heard the car on the gravel lane. She had been there since Thursday, finishing the work she'd started in February. She set down the book she was reading, smoothed her jacket, and waited. The car that pulled up was Fletcher's black company SUV. Now technically his personal vehicle, since the company barely had the revenue to cover its own operating costs. He got out alone. No Greer, no Serena. That meant he had come to negotiate, or thought he had. He stopped when he saw the cottage. The porch had been rebuilt from new lumber, stained to match the original. The front door was painted a deep slate blue. Both windows were clean, the glass replaced where it had cracked, and through them the warm light of the restored interior was visible from the lane. The outbuilding behind the cottage had a new roof on the east side, its walls re-sided and solid. The vines on the chimney had been cut back and the stonework repointed. Fletcher stood in the lane for a moment looking at all of it. Then he walked to the door and knocked. Lavinia opened it before the second knock. She had dressed carefully that morning. Dark trousers, a gray wool blazer, low boots. Nothing expensive on display, but nothing careless either. She looked like a woman who had somewhere to be after this and wasn't concerned about either appointment. "Fletcher," she said, "come in." He stepped inside and looked around. The front room had been cleared of the rotted chairs and the decades of grit. The stone fireplace had been cleaned and the hearth relaid. A reading chair sat near the window. Bookshelves along the east wall held a mix of Lavinia's own books and several of Cornelius Pratt's journals in protective sleeves. A small table near the kitchen doorway held a coffee pot and 2 cups, as if she had been expecting company. She had been. "You've been busy," Fletcher said. His tone was flat, taking inventory. "I've had time." She gestured to the chair across from hers. "Sit down." He sat, but not easily. He looked at the bookshelves, at the journals, at the general condition of the room, and his expression moved through several calculations she could follow without much effort. "The condemnation petition," he said. "I assume you know about it." "I do." "The building was a safety hazard. It's a legitimate filing." "The building had a partially collapsed roof on one side," Lavinia said, "which has since been repaired. The petition will be dismissed." Josephine filed the response 2 weeks ago. Fletcher's jaw moved slightly. "Josephine." "My attorney, Josephine Tate." She poured coffee into both cups and set one in front of him. "The tax reassessment is also being contested. The assessor's office based the new valuation on comparable parcels with road access and utility connections. This parcel has neither, which makes the comparison invalid. That will be corrected." He looked at her across the table. "What do you want, Lavinia?" "I want to show you something." She stood, walked to the bookshelf, and took down a folder she had placed there that morning. She laid it open on the table in front of him. It was a copy of the 1931 trust document with Josephine's legal summary attached, and behind it the updated mineral rights appraisal. Fletcher picked up the top page and read. He read the second page. She set the folder down and picked it up again, which told her the first read hadn't gone the way he expected. "This is what Owen left me," she said. "Not the cottage. The cottage was the door. This is what was behind it." Fletcher set the folder down. His face had gone carefully still, in the way faces go still when the person behind them is working through something fast and doesn't want the work to show. Subsurface mineral rights, he said, transferring to the property owner of record on March 3rd, 2031, 6 years from now. The current appraisal puts the value of those rights between $4 and $6 million, depending on market conditions at the time of transfer. She paused. Owen knew. He found the trust documents the same way I did. He left me the property because he wanted me to have this, not because he had nothing better to leave. Fletcher was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a bird called twice from the tree line and went silent. There's a second folder, Lavinia said. She placed it on the table beside the first one. She did not open it for him. He opened it himself. Oscar's documentation ran to 31 pages, 7 years of transfer records, account statements, the subsidiary account structures, Greer's incorporation filings for the shell entities used to move the money. Fletcher's name appeared on page 3 and did not stop appearing. He read 6 pages before he put it down. His coffee sat untouched and cooling in front of him. "Where did you get these?" he said. It came out flat, not quite a question. "Owen kept records," Lavinia said. "He kept very good records. He just kept them somewhere you never thought to look." Fletcher looked up at her then, and for the first time since the will reading, he was not entirely sure of the room he was in. The silence in the room ran long enough that the bird outside called again from the tree line, and this time didn't stop, a long, sustained note that carried through the restored windows and then faded. Fletcher closed the second folder. He did not push it away. He left both folders on the table in front of him, side by side, and looked at them the way a man looks at a bill he can't dispute but isn't ready to pay. "What do you want?" he said again. This time it was a real question. Lavinia had thought about this moment for 3 months. She'd written out what she wanted to say, crossed it out, written it again. In the end, she had decided that the shorter version was the right one. "The company," she said, "whatever is left of it, sign back to me, with full documentation of the transfers Oscar identified, so the record reflects what happened. You resign all directorial positions and remove yourself from any association with the business within 30 days. Fletcher's expression shifted. "The company is worth almost nothing now. I know what it's worth. That's not the point." He looked at her steadily. "And the documents." "Stay with me." She held his gaze. "You disappear from my life completely. No more petitions, no more shell companies, no more tax maneuvers, no contact of any kind. And Oscar's files stay in a locked drawer. The moment I see your attorney's name attached to anything touching this property or the company, the files go to the district attorney's office the same afternoon. Josephine has standing instructions." Fletcher leaned back in his chair. He was working through it, she could see that, running the numbers the way he always ran numbers, looking for the angle, the counter move. But there wasn't one, and they both knew it. The embezzlement documentation was complete. Oscar had been thorough in the specific way that former IRS investigators are thorough. Not flashy, just airtight. 31 pages with no gaps, no assumptions, nothing that required interpretation. Fletcher could hire Greer and 3 other attorneys and spend a year contesting it. And at the end of that year, he would still be looking at the same 31 pages. "My father left you a broken cottage," he said finally. "Your father left me exactly what he meant to leave me." Something moved across Fletcher's face then. Not quite remorse, not quite grief, something in the neighborhood of both without being either. He had not, she thought, spent much time considering that Owen had acted deliberately, that the restructured estate and the $6 deed and the rusted key had all been choices made by a man who understood what he was doing. It seemed to be landing on Fletcher now in a way it hadn't before. He picked up the coffee cup, found it cold, set it back down. "I'll have Greer draw up the transfer documents," he said. "You'll have Josephine draw them up," Lavinia said. "Greer doesn't touch this paperwork." A long pause. Then, "Fine." He stood, straightened his jacket, and looked around the room one more time, at the restored fireplace, the clean windows, the bookshelves with their mix of current reading and century-old journals. Whatever he had expected to find when he turned onto rural Route 7 that morning, it had not been this. "The mineral rights," he said. 6 years. 6 years. He nodded once, more to himself than to her, and walked out. She listened to the SUV start back down the lane and disappear onto the county road. Then she sat in her reading chair for a long time without moving. The transfer documents were signed 3 weeks later in Josephine's conference room. Fletcher arrived on time, signed where he was told to sign, and left without speaking to Lavinia beyond a single nod when he came through the door. Greer was not present. A notary witnessed the signatures. Josephine filed the paperwork before the end of the business day. The company that came back to Lavinia was smaller than the one Owen had built. 12 trucks instead of 31. 3 long-term contracts instead of a full regional portfolio. The operating accounts were thin. But the debt had been restructured during Owen's final year, so what remained was clean. No liens, no hidden obligations, nothing borrowed against assets that no longer existed. She gave day-to-day management to a man named Curtis Webb, who had driven for Owen for 19 years and knew the routes, the clients, and the contracts better than anyone still employed there. Curtis had stayed through the decline without complaint, had kept his drivers paid on time from his own pocket twice when Fletcher's transfers had drained the operating accounts dry, and had never once spoken to the press or to a lawyer about what he suspected. He deserved the position, and he took it without making a production of the offer. Within 4 months, the company was covering its own costs. Within 8, it was generating a modest surplus. It would never be what Owen had built at its peak, but it was honest, and it was moving forward, and that was the direction that mattered. The Tipton County assessor corrected the rural Route 7 valuation in July, following Josephine's formal challenge. The condemnation petition was dismissed in August for lack of standing, given that the alleged hazards had been remediated. Tipton Rural Holdings was dissolved the following month, its registered agent having withdrawn from practice. In September, Lavinia drove back to Harwick and spent a week in the archive with a historian from Vanderbilt who had been researching Appalachian folk medicine and had contacted her after Josephine sent a careful, limited inquiry to the university's history department. The historian's name was Dr. Patricia Cho. She stood at the entrance to the archive staircase for a full minute before she could speak. Lavinia understood the feeling. She had stood in the same spot herself. The Mercer Foundation opened its doors in the spring of the following year, operating out of the restored cottage on rural Route 7. Its work was specific, helping people who had been cheated out of inheritances, defrauded by those they trusted, or pushed out of what was rightfully theirs by family members with better lawyers and fewer scruples. The cases came in slowly at first, referred by Josephine's network and by a family law clinic in Nashville that had more clients than capacity. Then word moved the way word moves in places where people talk, through churches, through community centers, through the waiting rooms of legal aid offices, and the referrals came faster. Lavinia hired Dorinda Walsh to run the administrative side. Dorinda was 57 and had spent 20 years as a paralegal before a back injury pulled her out of full-time work. She had a memory for case details that made Oscar comment, only half joking, that she should have been the investigator. She kept the intake files, managed the calendar, handled correspondence, and made sure that everyone who came through the door was offered coffee and a chair before anyone asked them a single question. Oscar stayed on retainer. Josephine took foundation cases at reduced rate when her schedule allowed and pro bono when it didn't. The funding came from Lavinia's careful liquidation of certain items from the archive, plant specimens that belonged to no traceable family, documents with purely academic value, a collection of early 20th century pharmaceutical catalogs that a medical history museum in Memphis paid a fair price to acquire. She sold only what had no other home. Everything with a name attached she kept. The cottage itself had become 2 things at once. The front room and the small addition off the east side handled foundation work, client meetings, document review, case preparation. The back of the building was Lavinia's home. A kitchen, a bedroom, a reading room with a wood stove, simple and sufficient. She walked the hollow each morning through whatever weather the season provided and came back for coffee and whatever the first hour of the day brought through the door. She had not spoken to Fletcher since the morning he signed the transfer documents and nodded his way out of Josephine's conference room. She had heard through Curtis that he and Serena had relocated to Atlanta. She did not ask for details beyond that, and Curtis didn't offer them. The archive below the outbuilding she had opened carefully and partially to the academic community. Dr. Patricia Cho from Vanderbilt had brought 2 graduate students in October and spent a week cataloging the journals, producing a 40-page preliminary report that described Cornelius Pratt as one of the most systematically thorough lay botanists operating in the American South in the first half of the 20th century. A journal article was in preparation. A small exhibition was being discussed for the following year. The deeper sections of the archive and the land documents, the trust papers, the mineral rights appraisal remained private. One evening in late October, just as the hollow was losing its light and the first real cold of autumn had come down from the ridge, a small car turned onto the gravel lane and parked carefully at the edge of the clearing. The driver sat inside for a few minutes before getting out. Lavinia watched from the window. She had seen that particular hesitation before. The woman who came to the door was perhaps 32. She wore a wool coat and carried a canvas bag over one shoulder and held it the way people hold things they are afraid of losing. She knocked twice, lightly. Lavinia opened the door. "Mrs. Mercer," the woman said, "my name is Naomi Cho. I found your foundation through Dr. Patricia Cho at Vanderbilt. She said you might be the right person to talk to." She stopped. "I think my great-grandmother left something here a long time ago. I know that probably sounds impossible." "Come inside," Lavinia said, "and there's coffee. Tell me her name." Her great-grandmother's name was Maylin Cho, and she had come through Harwick in the summer of 1932, traveling with her husband and young daughter from California toward the eastern seaboard to stay with family while her husband looked for work. The Depression had pushed them off one route and onto another, and some road condition or detour had taken them through Tipton County. On a day when Mei Lin, who had trained as an herbalist in Guangdong province before emigrating, had stopped at a cottage on a hollow road to ask directions and ended up staying for 3 days talking plants with the solitary man who lived there. She had left him a small cedar box containing 47 seed packets, each labeled in her own hand in both Chinese and English, representing varieties she had carried from her family's garden in China and grown on through years of difficult American soil. She had no room for them on the next leg of the journey and no certainty the family would have the right conditions to keep them alive. She trusted Cornelius Pratt with them because she had spent 3 days learning that he was the kind of man who kept things alive. The cedar box was in Cabinet 7 of the archive, exactly where it had been placed in 1932. When Lavinia set it in Naomi's hands, the younger woman held it against her chest without opening it and stood very still for a moment. "She told my grandmother about this place until the day she died," Naomi said. "My grandmother told my mother. My mother told me. 3 generations of women passing down a story about a man in a hollow who could be trusted." Lavinia looked at her. "He could be trusted. And now you're here." Naomi opened the box. The seed packets inside were dry and perfectly preserved, each one labeled in a hand that was 92 years old and still clear. She touched the top packet carefully, one finger across the paper. "How do I thank you for this?" she said. Lavinia thought about Owen's letter on the floor of that cold bedroom. She thought about the iron key turning in a padlock she hadn't expected to find. She thought about Cornelius Pratt building his archive alone in a hollow that most maps had already forgotten, keeping faith with people he had no reason to expect would ever return. "You already have," she said, "by coming, by remembering her name." After Naomi left, driving slowly down the lane with the cedar box secured on the passenger seat, Lavinia locked the archive and walked outside. The hollow was full dark now, the tree line a black edge against a sky that still held a thin strip of orange along the ridge. The cottage windows glowed behind her. Somewhere down the creek, a heron called once and went quiet. She had been given a broken cottage for $6 and a key that fit a lock nobody remembered. She had been laughed at in a lawyer's office by people who assumed that what looked worthless was worthless, and that what looked finished was finished. She was 69 years old, and she had never been more certain of where she stood. Fletcher had tried to take the land. The county had tried to condemn it. Greer had filed his petition and dissolved his shell company and moved on to other work. All of it had washed past the hollow like weather, leaving the cottage standing and the archive intact and the creek running on as it always had. Owen had known her well enough to leave her the one thing that required patience to find and patience to keep. Not money, not a business, a trust. A set of kept promises reaching back 100 years, asking her to add her own. She went back inside, put the kettle on, and sat down at the kitchen table where the next week's case files were stacked and waiting. 41 years of living inside a world that ran on inherited power had taught her exactly one useful thing. The people who hold on quietly, who build without announcing it, who wait with their eyes open, they are the ones who are still standing when the noise dies down. The hollow held its silence around the cottage, the same silence it had held for Owen and for Cornelius Pratt before him. She had learned to read it the way Owen said she would. She was home. She had work to do. And tomorrow, more people would come down that gravel lane looking for someone who understood what it meant to have been dismissed by people who should have known better. She would be here. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.